Good morning. It is Thursday, March the 3rd, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have ultimate power, no free lunch, and the conclusion to the book, How We Got Here, the 70s. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March 3rd. I will deliver you from your enemies. I will show myself faithful to the faithful and blameless to the blameless. I will save the humble but bring low those whose eyes are haughty. I will keep your lamp burning and turn your darkness into light. With my help you can advance against a troop and scale the protective wall of your enemy. I am the God who arms you with strength and keeps your way secure. I make your feet like the feet of a deer and will provide a broad path for your feet. You will pursue your enemies and overtake them. You will crush them under your feet, and they will not be able to rise. I am the God who avenges you and subdues nations under your feet. Psalm 18. Prayer declaration. The Lord lives. Praise be to my rock. Exalted be God, my Savior. He is the God who avenges me, who subdues nations under my feet. He has exalted me above my foes and rescued me from violent men. He gives his king great victories and shows his unfailing love to his anointed. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 3rd. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you. So what is the true conservative strategy for defeating the socialists politically in this country? It is to attack the socialists from the bottom up, to demoralize and defeat the rank and file socialist that we encounter each and every day. And by so doing, we will discourage them from returning people like Nancy Pelosi to office. Thank you. What are the true conservative tactics in support of true conservative strategy to defeat the socialists? Number one, and most important, that the true conservative refuse to prove a negative and insist that the socialist instead prove a positive. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. I've never understood why it is greed to want and keep the money you've already earned, but not greed to want to take somebody else's money. Thomas Sowell. This is the irony of the political rhetoric that saturates modern economic discussion. The never-ending ring of voices decrying greed are always doing so from a posture of wanting to take what belongs to someone else. We have turned basic definitions on their head. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. Ultimate power. Look into Washington, and I'm frustrated about the fact that the conservatives and Republicans in office don't do anything. They just sit on their ass and do nothing. They're basically watching while their opponents tear themselves apart, so to speak, or throw away their political power. And there's an old saying in Washington that if your enemy or your opponent is busy destroying himself, get out of the way and let them do so. And so that seems to be their strategy right now. We'll just go ahead and let the Democrats tear themselves and each other down, and then we will reap the benefits or the rewards of that come November. The problem with that is, what's your mandate? Because I was thinking about this as I was listening to Hugh Hewitt, and they were whining and complaining about old Joe and what the old fart administration was doing or not doing vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And again, it was more complaints. What I'm not hearing from Hewitt or his guest is, what does the GOP plan to do about it? What is the GOP? At first I thought, what are they going to do when they get elected, when they get the majority come November? And then I thought, why even wait till then? What are you going to do now? What are you doing now? It's like the complaint that I hear from Sean Hannity about the people that are left behind in Afghanistan, Americans held hostage. Well, what are you doing about it? If you really give a damn about Americans, why aren't you doing something about it? So there's that. And also what you've been seeing is on the left is an example of that, where for years, and this is all something that, again, I call ultimate power. It's about ultimate power. When I was in the Air Force, and you would, as a two-striper, you would think, I would really like to say this, or I'd really like to do that, but you tell yourself, no, I don't have ultimate power. I've got to wait until I get promoted. Once I go up to the next rank, then I will be able to have enough power. Then what happens is you end up getting up promoted, let's say all the way up to Chief Master Sergeant, and you're still not doing anything. You're still not making a difference. You're still sitting around waiting for things to happen. Why? Because you think that you need ultimate power in order to be able to act, when in fact, all you need is the power you already have. Okay? Because every time you get promoted into a larger sphere of influence. Okay? Your Chief Master Sergeant doesn't operate at the same level as a two-striper. Okay? He operates has a much bigger sphere of influence with a lot more people, a lot of other people in there, a lot of other very powerful people in that sphere of influence. So that's part of that illusion of ultimate power keeps people from acting. And what's happened, you see on the left, that for decades they had the same illusion. Well, we can't do single payer. We can't do this. We can't do that because we don't have enough power. We don't have the House. We don't have the Senate. We don't have a bulletproof majority in the Senate, et cetera, et cetera. And the young people in the Democrat Party got tired of listening to this. And they said, damn it, get off your dead ass and do something, or there isn't going to be a Democrat Party. Okay. And this younger people led the way. They went to Portland. They said, we're not going to wait until we have ultimate power. We're going to go ahead and attack the status quo immediately with whatever it is that we happen to have. And so that's what the Democrat Party's been doing. They've been taking whatever power they happen to have and using it. Another example of that is what happened in Texas, where the Texas state legislature is dominated by Republicans, and they were going to pass a bill, an anti-abortion bill, and the Democrats, as a way of exerting some sort of power, all fled the state so as to prevent a vote on this particular bill in the first place. And ultimately the bill passed, but at least they did something. And the same thing that goes here today for the Republicans. The Republicans need to start getting off their dead ass and doing something. And if you have outrages that are being perpetrated or planned to be perpetrated by the left, then, and if it means that every Republican in Washington has to jump on a plane and fly away to prevent a quorum from taking place so that the Democrats can't get there, then do it. You go out and do it. You take the power you already have and work with that power instead of sitting around saying, well, we don't have ultimate power, because that's what's going to happen in November. Yes, there's going to be a majority, if you believe the pundits, of Republicans in the House. What about the Senate? And how big of a majority in the Senate? Let's assume it's 3, 4, 5 people. Now what? They're going to simply say, well, we still don't have enough power because we don't have 2/3 in the Senate. Or they're going to say, well, yeah, we have a majority, but 2 or 3 of our members are rhinos. So it's still kind of squishy. Okay. So there's always going to be an excuse not to act. I don't have enough power. And the Republicans need to get rid of this idea of ultimate power and realize that it's a chimera. It's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. And you act with what you have. You take the power and use the power that you already have. Thank you. And now, the conclusion to the book, How We Got Here, the 70s, the decade that, for better or for worse, gave us modern life. For half a century, Americans have been asked to choose between 2 myths about their country's recent past. In one, the heroes are the parents. In the other, the children. In the parents' myth, the middle years of this century were a time of peace and prosperity, the well-deserved reward for enduring the Depression, defeating the Nazis, and resisting communism. In the children's, those same years were a dark epoch of racism, sexism, and homophobia, when Hollywood liberals flinched every time the doorbell rang, fearing it was the FBI to come tell them they couldn't write screenplays anymore. In the children's myth, Americans huddled frozen and miserable, like Pepperland under the dominion of the blue meanies in the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, until the brave, joyous protesters of the 60s liberated them. In the parents, a golden age of patriotism and duty was wrecked by draft-dodging, pot-smoking, hippie-turned-yuppie lowlifes. It is like the extinction of the dinosaurs. 1 minute giants are crashing or walking the earth, then suddenly crash. A comet smacks the planet, and the giants are replaced overnight by tiny, rat-like creatures. In the 1990s, the stock of the parents' myth soared way above the children's. The scandals of the Clinton presidency touched off an explosion of baby boomer self-disgust. Vice President Al Gore declared himself a candidate for the presidency in 1999 with a speech in which he distanced himself as far as possible from the experiences of his generation, recalling the pride with which he had worn his country's uniform in war and describing faith and family as his deepest commitments. Former draft evaders queued in bookstores to buy Tom Brokaw's Valentine to their wartime parents, the greatest generation. Over on the political left, writers like Cornel West and Sylvia Hewitt rehabilitated the once demonized 1950s as a time when high school a graduate could adequately support a wife and family. The final blow to the children's myth. The millions of Americans born since 1970 seem to have collectively decided that the boomers are absolutely the most boring generation of old fogies ever to have inflicted their reminiscences on the young. The aging 60s hipster who will not shut up is a figure of fun in television hits from Britain's Absolutely Fabulous to MTV's Daria. Liberation? The record of the years from 1965 to 1980 is blotted by the abandonment of a desperate ally to a ruthless enemy, South Vietnam to the Communist North, the collapse of educational standards, the dissolution of the ideal of racial equality into rancorous arguments over special privileges, the discharge of hundreds of thousands of mentally ill people to fend for themselves on the sidewalks, rampant drug abuse, the shattering of millions of families by divorce, and the savaging of American cities by crime and disorder. The effect of liberty to individuals is, Edmund Burke wrote 2 centuries ago, that they may do what they please. We ought to see what it will please them to do before we risk congratulations, which may soon turn into complaints. The parents' myth is much more appealing than the other. Who would not be prouder of having fought through the mud of Guadalcanal than having fornicated in the mud at Woodstock? But a better myth is a myth all the same. It is still as foolish to idealize the past as to condescend to it. The greatest generation was also the statist generation. Like them or loathe them, the middle decades of the 20th century were an entirely anomalous period in American history. Never had the state been so strong. Never had people submitted as uncomplainingly. Never had the country been so more economically equal. Never had it been more ethnically homogeneous. Seldom was its political consensus more overpowering. You can see now why people might pine for those days, but they would pine for them if they remembered more clearly that the top rate of federal income tax was 90%, or that it was a very serious crime for a private citizen to own a gold coin, or that the Attorney General could wiretap more or less anybody he wanted to without a warrant, if he attested he was doing so for national security purposes. The Secretary of State could prevent any American he considered a security risk from traveling abroad by denying him a passport. When mayors and governors wanted to knock down existing neighborhoods to build highways, there was nothing much that anybody could do to stop them. They even got to decide for themselves, without much second-guessing, what constituted adequate compensation. To ship a crate of lettuce across the country, a trucker needed permission from a federal regulatory agency. Almost one-third of the country's best jobs were off-limits for anyone who refused to join a union. The story of the past must do justice to both its achievements and its destructiveness, equally to the obsolete and oppressive laws that have been uprooted and to the decent and valuable habits and institutions that were unnecessarily smashed. Justice must be done not solely for the sake of honesty, important as that is, but also for a very practical reason. Unless the people of the present day correctly understand the social convulsion of the 1970s, they will stumble into fatal errors of judgment about their own times and their own lives. This danger is more than hypothetical. If the only way to stabilize the family and solidify the nation is by bringing the dead back to life, then the family will not be stabilized and the nation will not be solidified. Coming a close second to nostalgia in the pageant of uselessness is a sort of complacency that looks at the wreckage left by the rampage of the 1970s and shrugs it off as the price of progress. Progress can come at a lower price, and when it does, it's a better bargain. Back in a minute. Thank you. Desegregation, the breezy self-confidence, the unthinking assumption of rectitude that buttressed American life in the 1940s and 1950s was exploded by the civil rights movement. The United States had saved civilization from Nazism. The civil rights movement charged that America bore a more than passing resemblance to Nazi Germany itself. It was a withering indictment and one to which America's leading institutions, from its wealthiest corporations to its greatest universities, immediately pled guilty. If America could have been so terribly blind to justice in this one way, might there not be other ways in which it was equally blind? That was the bitter question that protest movement after protest movement would hurl at the country after 1965, and the country would never again feel entirely confident that the protesters were wrong. Inflation, the statist economics of mid-century America, generated the inflation of the 1970s and dismally failed to curb it. The controls and regulations meant to soften the ups and downs of the market acted instead like those breakwaters that beach towns build to stop the shifting of the sands. The longer the energy of the ocean is balked, the more terrible is the smash when it finally arrives. Perhaps it might be well to add a fourth word, technology. Social democracy was born on the assembly line and died with it. As companies grew huger and huger after 1880, it became natural to wonder why they could not grow still larger until the entire economy merged into one enterprise under one central management. The Germans seem to have done exactly that with brilliant success during the First World War, creating what no less an authority than Lenin regarded as the world's first functioning socialist state. The great English jurist A.V. Dicey observed in 1905 that the dominant intellectual trend of his times had been the revolt against individualism in favor of collectivism. This trend arrived late in the United States and provoked more resistance there than anywhere else. In the 1920s, Jeffersonian Democrats like New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt fiercely condemned Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover for trying to herd American industry into officially sanctioned cartels that would earn steadily profits and could thus pay higher wages. But the Great Depression overcame individualist qualms, and by 1933, Roosevelt was adapting and expanding Hoover's cartels far beyond their unhappy author's wildest imaginings. The Supreme Court declared the cartels unconstitutional in 1935, but an even more sweeping system of collectivization was self-imposed during the war, and by the 1950s, left-leaning social theorists were confidently speculating that the United States and the Soviet Union might yet converge upon a system of democratic elections and socialized industry. The great wars of the 20th century were fought by societies already predisposed to collectivism. Indeed, as the unfashionable anti-collectivists passionately argued, it was this bias toward collectivism that predisposed those societies towards war. The stability of mid-century was the product of special, in some ways, un-American circumstances: war and mobilization for war, the heyday of heavy industry, a depression that convinced normally individualistic Americans to submit to unprecedented direction and regimentation. A carapace, or shell, of control had been locked upon the country as an emergency measure. But as the emergency dragged on for decade after decade, the shell chafed and abraded. In the 1970s, the country at last burst through it. Back in a minute. Thank you. In bursting through the shell, Americans did not pause to distinguish between obsolete and unnecessary restrictions and good and wise ones. They smashed them all. Quarter century later, as they sift through the shreds or shards and fragments of their grandparents' world, they have begun to feel regret. Suddenly, American society seems on the verge of a great turn away from self-indulgence of the 1970s and toward what? Toward something more like the normal conditions of American life, the sprawling, garrulous, individualistic, fractious, unequal, polyglot republic of the early 21st century looks a very great deal like the republic of the beginning of the 20th. Then as now, the United States was haunted by cares and doubts. Old certainties had collapsed, and the new certainties, socialism, eugenics, imperialism, war, threatened traditional values and ideals. City streets jabbered in foreign tongues. Racial tensions pervaded the country. The sudden agglomeration of wealth raised the ominous question of how democratic government could survive the arrogance of the rich and the envy of the poor. Family life seemed to be disintegrating as the rise of great cities encouraged unhappy men to desert their families, and the weakening of religion chipped away at traditional sexual norms. The social stability of the 1950s was not inherited from some distant past. It was a self-conscious achievement of a society that had overcome its disorder, doubt, and disunity. And when that stability was lost, the disorder, the doubt, and the disunity returned. Some have boldly suggested that American society is walking back from the cultural abyss as it approached in the 1970s. It's possible to imagine the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s as a kind of tidal wave that inundated homes and lives, but that is now receding, leaving the beach messy but essentially unchanged. But is that really true? Item. After losing a nasty custody battle for the 3-year-old daughter she had deliberately conceived with a man she barely knew, pop star Sinead O'Connor concluded, "I wouldn't do that again. Not because it's immoral, but because it was stressful." O'Connor is an oddball in many ways, but here, for once, she's perfectly conventional. Early 21st century's newly cautious society, not a remoralized one, and even that caution extends only so far. Americans born between 1963 and 1972, who therefore came of age during the worst of the AIDS epidemic, are actually more sexually promiscuous even than their baby boomer elders. Back in a minute. Thank you. But if remoralization is not yet a fact, it can still be an aspiration. Americans are people of anxious conscience, and they do not seem very pleased with themselves these days. They see corruption in office, and their fellow citizens apparently acquiescing in it. They see pervasive child neglect, disrespect for legitimate authority, quotas in the workplace, gruesome crimes in the quiet towns, misspellings in the letters from their children's teachers, smut on the airwaves, the hardening misery of the poorest of the poor. They lack the vocabulary to express their misgivings. How can one judge if one has been taught all one's life that it is wicked to be judgmental? But rendering the misgivings inarticulate does not make them go away. So let's be articulate. It is not true that things in general were better half a century ago. Things in many respects were worse, more militaristic, less innovative, more statist, less tolerant, more unionized, less humane, more prejudiced. Nostalgia for the past would be misplaced, and even if it were not, nostalgia is the weakest and most useless of emotions, the narcotic of the defeated and the helpless. But if things in general were not better, some things in particular were. It was better when people showed more loyalty to family and country, better when they read more and talked about themselves less, better when they restrained their sexuality, better when professors and curators were unafraid to uphold high intellectual and artistic standards, better when immigrants were expected to Americanize promptly, better when not every sorrow begat a lawsuit. And if things were better in these respects and others like them, if Americans really feel that way, then there is something healthier to do than pine for the last lost days of the past. The very fact that so many people feel that all is not well, surely the best proof one could ask for of how much is well, that one's fellow citizens and fellow creatures are not morally numb, that they have consciences and memories. It is discontent, after all, that moves humanity, that invents the umbrella, the toothpick, the airplane, the microchip. It is discontent that moves us morally too, not backward, because the past never returns, no matter how lovely it was, but onward, away from the follies and triumphs of the 1970s, and toward something new. New vices, new virtues, new sins, and new progress. And that was the conclusion of the book, How We Got Here, the 1970s, the decade that, for better or worse, shaped our society. So next time I'm going to be reading from at least one book. I may decide to do two, but the book I want to approach next is called Government Against Itself. And it's all about public employee unions and what a mistake it was for us to have public employee unions. So that's going to start tomorrow. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.